Welcome to What Is It About the Weather? I'm your host, Mark Jelinek, and this week we're going to be talking about how can you expand your weather world? Get to know a little bit more about the topic that we touch on every so often here. Okay, once a week or so. But before I do that, let me just say I hope you've had an interesting and intertwined weather week, and maybe a little less chaotic than mine has been. My weather-related world got turned on its head last night. We had, for those that don't know, I currently live in the Atlanta, Georgia area. We had a major section of interstate that's kind of a portion that's elevated as you get closer to downtown, that a fire started underneath it and collapsed a section of the interstate. Going to be, I don't know, who knows how long. I mean, they're just now starting to dig through the rubble. They'll probably have to take out more than actually collapsed. And, so we're talking weeks at a minimum of, again, those that don't know Atlanta well, a city, let's just say, of over 5 million people. And it's a bigger, sprawling sort of setup. So a lot of people do use these roadways. So as you can imagine, if you shut off a artery that, let's say, 1.5 million people, or I don't know how many actually use it. Let's say we'll just use 1 million on average, in the course of a day, and it's just non-usable. And again, we've got another major corridor that comes into it and merges with it that won't be usable either. And what that'll do to traffic across the city is kind of crazy. And so, this impacts me in trying to get to campus. Now, I had already used mass transit quite a bit when I was going to campus, but of course that mass transit system is now going to be taxed even further. And in Atlanta, we're not particularly known for using our mass transit, so this will be quite a test to see how all that goes down and what really happens. But now me getting to campus and doing my teaching, now fortunately the semester's only got another month or so in terms of teaching time left. But nonetheless, my weather world just got a bit more crazy as I have to figure out how to get to campus effectively and in a timely manner when I got to go in to teach. So we'll see. I'm sure we'll all get by, but certainly I'm sure some tensions will rise and some blood pressures will elevate over the next month or so, however long it takes to get this all sorted out. So without further ado, let's just dive into this week's topic. Now, long before I was doing this podcast, and since I've been doing this podcast, I've gotten questions that kind of fall into a similar bucket. Now, a lot of times it's parents, and they're wonder how to get their kid who maybe has some interest in weather kind of started on the track of understanding a little more about it. It's any scientific topic. You may get a little of it in school growing up, but it's not necessarily a focus. And that means that a lot of kids who have an interest in it don't really get exposed to the science of it. I mean, we're all, we're all exposed to it generally every day as we live through it, of course. But, some people want to understand a little bit more. And, it doesn't include just parents with kids. Like I said, that may be one of the primary groups, but I get questions all the time. And a lot of times it will have to do with a specific topic. Like somebody's interested in learning more about hurricanes or tropical cyclones, or maybe something more about the different types of winter weather precipitation or whatever it might be. And as you know, the focus for us is usually not talking so much about the weather events that are going on around us, but more about, how weather impacts our lives. So we don't always get into the science. We touch it from time to time. But I thought I'd take a chance to, share some different resources that I've come across over time that I think can be good for different levels. Again, this is going to be tricky because I want to provide you all with an opportunity to both get started and potentially get a little deeper in your knowledge of the weather. Now, we certainly live in a day and age where there's no shortage of information available on any one topic, right? But a lot of times the real question is, how do you narrow that search down to find good information? And before we get into some of the resources that I'm going to recommend, I would tell you that if you're really wanting to understand more about weather, or meteorology more specifically, or just a specific aspect of weather, whatever it might be, or, digging further on some of the things we talk about here, which is more about, maybe weather impacts on other aspects of life, there's a few questions that I generally recommend, and this doesn't even have to do with, looking into weather and increasing your weather knowledge. It can be increasing any type of knowledge you want to expand upon. And the first thing is, what are you really interested in? Maybe try to narrow it down. You don't want to over narrow it, but think really about, is there some aspect, or is it the broad topic? Kind of start there. And then I think some other things that are important with that process before you start digging in is kind of regrouping about how you like to learn. Think about yourself a little bit, and do you do better when you're reading material? Do you do better watching videos or listening to podcasts, as an example? Are you really more interested in kind of a passive scenario, or really digging into the material, those sort of things? And of course, there's always the question of how much time do you have available? Because with any topic, I don't care whether it's an advanced scientific topic or something more, seemingly trivial. As you know, you can get digging into things and find yourself down a deep rabbit hole if you don't watch it. So kind of maybe think about those questions as you go through the process that will help you, whether you're looking at the resources I provide or you're just going out to Google or some other search engine and saying, okay, help me get to this material. But with those questions in mind, let's talk about a few different resources. And again, I'm going to try to hit from different perspectives, recognizing that different people like to absorb material different ways. And, now we live in this day and age where it's easier to do that, of course, right? 15, 20 years ago, it was hard to get videos of people talking about these topics. Then there weren't even really podcasts. So about your only option was printed material. And even then, the internet was kind of in its infancy, and so some of the material was rather limited. But what's interesting is some of that information that came out, let's say in the last 20 years, as the internet really got started, is still very useful today. And some of the initial sources, and let's say your preferred method is you like to read, and maybe you want some graphics thrown in, but you really like to absorb things maybe at a pace you can set. And that's always one of the challenges with video or audio material, is if you're not catching the information in real time and it's not making sense to you, it's kind of hard to re-listen. Or you might want to complement, if you're going to absorb by audio or video, through some printed material. And there's a few resources that I know I used when I was getting back into science again, and particularly into meteorology, that I still recommend today. And the level of depth is more of an intro level. Okay, so most people can do it, but each one of them has their strengths and weaknesses. And there's 3 of them specifically that I'm going to recommend. Now, they're all websites and have generally been around, for a while now. They're well established. The first is called The Weather Prediction. And the site was developed by a meteorologist called Jeff Habe. And I hope I'm pronouncing his name right. But it's kind of a pretty in-depth, or you can get in-depth. And he hits on a lot of topics that are, kind of the basics, but he gets into some that are in more detail, or even one, I'm looking at one now that's on the screen, calculus, is it needed to be a forecaster. And he talks about, the importance of it and how to go through different topics, maybe with a different perspective, or again, answering some questions that people have. So it's not just meteorological topics in a sense of this is, how to look at a cold front or a warm front or whatever it might be. But there's more information to it than that. But he covers the basics very well. And it's a site that, I've referenced when I wanted to read more material or I was getting introduced to something. But even as I was preparing the class and thinking back to when I didn't know this stuff, what were ways of it being presented that might make sense to me? So, very good site, highly recommended. The next one has a little more of an academic connection. It was designed with the University of Illinois, and again, it was designed some time ago. It's called Weather World 2010 Project. Now, that's going to sound dated, right? Because it was done, but it was done well before that. And again, it's kind of set up more in the style of some of these online website education type websites that came out before there were really online learning tools, right? So, very structured kind of guides, but the information is presented in smaller snippets. The one that I just mentioned, the weather prediction before, sometimes it's little things, but sometimes it's you're reading a full amount or a fair amount of information that would scan the equivalent of a few pieces of paper, whereas this site tends to take it in much smaller snippets and tends to have more of a graphical component or a picture component to support that information. Now, again, the site hits a little bit of everything, and as well as some of the basics in terms of the science, not just the weather. Things as simple as going through things like Coriolis force, which is a very big thing in the weather world with the spin of our planet, but you don't necessarily think about it. So there's the science, really. If you really want to get into the science, but really want to start with small little snippets, this can be a good place to go and do it. And the third website is one that has continued to evolve and expand over time, and it's called Comet. And it's done through what's called UCAR. That's a phrase that may not mean a lot to folks that are outside the science world, but it's the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research. And don't get hung up in the acronym. Just know that there's a lot of educational aspect to it, but they work with data sets and on the research side of things. But the COMET program, originally, it was geared towards maybe, I don't know the best way to think about it, maybe expanding the education of some people that have some introductory knowledge about meteorology. But it's now, I really think of it as a great go-to source, whether you're getting started or whether you have some knowledge already. And what I particularly like about it is, like I said, the program has expanded over time. So new modules have gotten added. And I was working on a lecture in the past week or so where I wanted to, put a different perspective on how material was being presented as a topic that I'd already covered in class, but one of the students wanted to get into a bit more detail. So I was looking at a lecture that somebody had given on the topic just to see if there might be a better way or a different way to present some of the material. Because again, I don't like to reintroduce the same thing twice the same way. I take opportunities like that to say, is there a better way to present it? Is there a different type of material that I could present that might help the topic sink in more? So I still use it today. And again, in some of the lectures I was doing, I pulled graphics from the COMET program. The level of depth can be pretty extensive, but again, it's also good intro, and it's a combination of things again, right? There's some video / audio presentation, and then there's some text or even modules that you could walk through with little quizzes, and that's part of what this program was developed for, is to offer a real more formal training to where you kind of get tested on the topic. So there's a lot more of that interactive educational style aspect to it. So if you really want to start digging in and even kind of test your knowledge, the COMET program can be a way to do that. Now, like I said, those are three, basic websites, and they're the places I would tell anybody to start. But they're certainly by no means an exclusive list. As I was going through developing lectures this semester, somebody had asked me to present something on the Southern Hemisphere, which is very different, in some cases visually, as to how to represent things. And you've always got to make sure you're turning your axis right and those sort of things when you're developing graphics. And it can take some time to redo the graphics to make sure you're presenting it. So I was looking for some other cases. Had somebody already done this sort of thing? And I came across a program, and the website it's EU Mettrain. And of course that just, has to do with the European element and educating meteorologists, of course. And it was built around satellite meteorology, so that imagery and using that to do other things. But they've got a few courses. Again, the focus is satellite, but they've got some stuff that hits on the broader topic. However, if you like the idea of focusing in on what we learn from those images we see all the time, it's a good resource. So there are additional websites like that are out there and available. Again, these are a core group that I think are good, but certainly you can come across more as you go through this process. Of course, there's also traditional print, right? You've heard me mention the WeatherWise magazine before. Again, kind of a good resource start if you want to get into increasing your knowledge, but maybe also have some of the things like we do here, which is some real life applications of how do these events sort of impact me, or how does the science impact me? As some people do in learning, they find that relationship to their everyday life to be a way to really drive home a point or make something sink in. And then, of course, there are also, traditional textbooks. I came across a book, and I'll put a link into it, that was made available. It was about meteorology, but done with a pre-calculus level. Now, I can recommend all sorts of books that would send you over the deep end, that send my brain sometimes over the deep end, that, dynamics of the atmosphere, stuff like that, that you open it up and it just seems like it's a big math book. Well, in the reality it is. And I've talked about the relationship between calculus and meteorology, but that doesn't mean a lot of the topics that we get into, a lot of the basic fundamental ideas, whether it's the ideal gas law, whether it's a hydrostatic equation, these things may sound big and lofty, but at their core, they're very small equations and very straightforward principles that once you understand, you can do a great deal of understanding the broader topics that we get into with meteorology. So this book tries to break it down and say, we don't have to have calculus to at least understand these topics. Yes, if you want to go do research or maybe work in the field, you're going to have to make that leap and that jump. But there's ways to get introduced to the material that don't have to be so extensive in terms of the depth of those mathematical equations. So I'll do that. And I will say also, with any of these things you do, understand what your local library offers, because I know in the system I'm in here in Georgia, there's also a broader thing across our state called Galileo, and it's kind of a information learning portal that has access to a lot of things, including some of the journals you've heard me mention before. And just knowing what's available, whether it's in books or whether it's in online resources that are not necessarily just the free stuff that you can find, which is good. The free stuff is good, but there are things that you might want to expand on a specific topic that you'll find having those resources available, or at least knowing what those resources are, to be a very useful thing. Now let's make that shift from more printed material. And like I said, some of these have some graphic animation, even some audio components like the Comet. There are some actual lectures that are contained within that program, but their focus is still print. However, I know, as with all people, print may just be a piece of the equation. I have a little bit of attention deficit, and it can be a little hard for me to get through papers sometimes. So I can appreciate that people want to learn other ways, and there are things that have come available over time. I came across one. I was looking at stuff. One of the challenges I always have with things is the video element, because it's still kind of new to me in terms of what's easily available. And I came across a site when I was doing some prep for this podcast by a meteorologist named Dave. I think it's Cacciarella. I may be saying that wrong, but he's a meteorologist in the state of Florida here in the U.S., but he also does some teaching at a local university, and he developed an online program, or it's part of an online program, but he has videos for his different lectures, and it covers a variety of topics. And it's a combination, again, he's speaking, but it's on YouTube, and he adds in there different slides. So it's more of like a classroom lecture type setup, but it's presented, you can go into YouTube, it's readily available, it's free. And that's just an example. Those are longer things, and there's lots of people getting into these shorter snippets. Heck, some of the things that we do from the podcast here, the little weather shorts, sometimes that's just weather, sometimes it's been little scientific topics, or the You Ask, We Answer series that we did in the very beginning. There's a lot of those sort of things. The challenge that I would say is, I came across the ones, like I've mentioned already, but people kind of dabble in these things. And so you may find that somebody's done 3 or 4 good videos, and you might be disappointed that they haven't done 100 videos. But I think as the platforms continue to mature, we'll see more resources available. Well, just know you can go out there on just about any meteorological topic and do a search and find viable videos. And you don't even have to necessarily start in just a broad search engine. You can go straight to a YouTube or some other video platform and search within their resources directly, and a lot of that information will be available. Now, from that standpoint, I also know people like to learn face-to-face, in person. I mean, some things it's still best interacting with somebody in real time and maybe being able to ask them questions. And I know, for an example here, in the U.S., we have a program called Skywarn. Now, this is more for people that are interested in kind of severe weather storms and things to look out for. And it's done by the National Weather Service here in the U.S., and they do it, around the country. And they go out locally and have these sessions where you learn about storms and identifying what you might be seeing in the skies. But that's a good opportunity to actually maybe interact with other people that have the interest, or interact with, different people from the local weather service office, in having them present this material and giving you a chance to dig in and understand a little bit more. And to that end, I recommend maybe contacting your local weather service and seeing if there's any other outreach that they might do. And this, I'm talking very broadly here across the globe. I mean, I have a very U.S.-centric perspective just because that's where I'm at. But I know, as an example, we have a local American Meteorological Society chapter here. Now, the big national chapter is very focused on the conferences and the research, and that might be a bit outside the scope of what most people are looking for. But the local chapter has some great speakers that come in. It's a few meetings a year, hit on different topics, and some of those groups are still very focused in the professional community, but some or, do encourage enthusiasts or other people that have an interest in the topic to get involved. So that can be an additional avenue, right? Because the memberships usually for these local chapters are a lot less than, the professional annual memberships through the national chapters. It can be an excellent opportunity, again, just to get exposed to people who think about weather, right? So maybe you have a kid who's really interested and is in high school. Well, those local chapters, and I've seen it with ours, dad brings his kid to some of these meetings when it's topics of interest to expose him and continue to provide an additional outlet for that educational outreach. Now, all these things have been very focused on the science of meteorology, but as with this podcast, right, we focus not so much necessarily on the weather itself and what we're doing, but how it relates to everyday life and different ways that we might want to think about weather that we haven't thought about it before. And certainly, if that's of interest to you, there are a variety of ways that you can explore and expand that knowledge as well. Now, we've talked about how it's National Weather Podcast Month, and as I've said, there were 8 of us, I think, in total that were part of this: the Weather Brains, Weather Junkies, Weather Hype, Stormfront Freaks, and Tornado Talk. I've all mentioned them previously. There were a couple of more that were part of this that, maybe they didn't have episodes that were specific to what I was talking about, but I'll just mention them here. The other 2 are Carolina Weather, and for those that are from the U.S., that there's a couple states, North and South Carolina, and the Southeast U.S. And this group, the podcast is part of what they do, but it's generally a group of meteorologists that are focused on that region and working in that region. So if the area is of interest to you, or you want to hear more of a meteorology angle on things, quite often, that's a good group to listen to. And the last one is Ice Station Houseman. A little more, they've been doing, I guess, about a year and a half now, a little less regular of a schedule, but a group of what I like that's interesting here is one of the persons is a meteorologist, one of the regular panelists, and the other 2 are not. So again, coming at it maybe from that non-meteorology angle, but still hit on a lot of the science topics quite a bit. So those podcasts, and what's great about podcasts, right, is you can do it actively. I mean, you can sit there and concentrate, or you can listen to it in the car. I mean, I have no idea where you're listening to this podcast right now, but that's the beauty of it, right? You can do it in a passive mode. And if a particular episode doesn't interest you, you can just skip right by it, right? There's no pressure to listen to every episode. So podcast, again, I like the audio element, and I like the fact that it can be both passive or something that you're more concentrated on and do it pretty much whenever you want, whether you're trying to figure out how to get around Atlanta traffic now, or whether you're, just listening in the background as you're doing some work in South Africa or Australia or, Japan. You're sitting on the beach and you're listening to What Is It About the Weather? Doesn't matter. You can do it just about anywhere. And I'll also mention, and these folks I've mentioned as well before, in terms of additional online resources that, again, you can kind of do as you want, and it's sort of in that passive active element as well, which is the Capital Weather Gang, and you've heard me mention that before. And their work, sometimes what they do is they forecast, some local weather events for the Washington, D.C. area, but they hit on a lot of the broader topics. And so a lot of their articles, if you did nothing else, just going in and reading their material would be a great thing to do. Get you into that expanded world of not just the world of weather, but the whole world of intertwined weather, right? And also Marshall Shepard, who's a past AMS president and does a thing called, or a show snippet on the Weather Channel, but he also writes a column for Forbes magazine. And he hits on a lot of these broader topics, not just the science. Sometimes it's more sciencey, but sometimes it's more kind of the intertwined weather element. So again, a variety of resources that are available to you, whether you want to focus on the weather or the larger intertwined aspect of it. And while we talked about, the local in-person things you can do, of course, the last element in this online world we live in today is maybe the whole kind of social aspect of it. Now, this has changed and evolved as the platforms have. The Weather Underground, who is now part of the IBM family or suite of weather products, used to have these personal weather blogs, and they're discontinuing that service. But there are other people that do these sort of things. There's a group called Storm Tracks, and they're focused on people that do storm chasing. But again, a lot of it, it's a kind of a chat realm sort of thing in the sense of that, but get into a lot of detail about weather topics sometimes. So you might want to check that out. The other thing I certainly recommend as well, it's tricky with social media, right? Some of the things, people get things started, they don't last. And you feel bad when you get invested into it and you think it's going to be something, and then a month later it turns into nothing. But look at your local media outlets, maybe where you absorb your weather information from, and see if they don't have a group. And I've mentioned here before, we've got a local station here in Atlanta, 11 Alive, and they have a community of about 1,000 people, and a lot of it's about posting weather pictures and just sharing, the weather in the community. But it's a chance to engage, and again, it's hopefully very weather enthusiast oriented, and provides an opportunity, right, to engage and talk to other people who understand weather, and talk, to the channel meteorologist and ask them questions from time to time. Now, they're not available 24/7 to do that, but again, a way to maybe branch out and broaden your connections in the weather world if it's something you want to do. So a whole suite of options, somewhat what I would call more vertical, going through specific training modules, some more broad, like the social media element, or, listening to podcasts and reading some of these websites and participating in local groups, whatever it might be, that provide you a chance to really dip your toe in or dive in if it's something you want to do. So as you go forward, just know that there are just countless resources, and I know I've taken kind of a U.S.-centric view with some of these things, but a lot of this material, while it may be written from a U.S.-centric perspective even, a lot of it is applicable worldwide. Like I said, there may be some challenges for those of you in the Southern Hemisphere, because sometimes you have to think, you got to flip this stuff on its axis, but there are real resources available, and not just in English, in other languages as well. So this is just kind of a few things that I know to share, but if you have other things that you want me to share with the listeners, let me know. If you've got resources or something that you think's good, or something that might be good for a specific group, don't hesitate to pass them along. All right. Enough about broadening your weather world. I'm last day of March, kind of saddened by the idea that winter's over, and I didn't have much of a winter. We got, I don't know, one kind of winter weather event here. But so I've been thinking and reminiscing about snow, as I'm not going to be probably seeing any more for a little while. That's not true. I'll probably make a trip to Chile sometime and see it in the Andes, but don't know that I'll get real close to it. But you a lot of times have probably heard this old adage that when you think about snow, and I know I'm going to do it in inches, not metric here, just because it's a phrase that I'm used to. When you think about snow, 10 inches of snow equals 1 inch of rain. And people wonder, is that valid? And does it have any basis? Well, it does have some basis, okay? And it really just has to do with a common temperature range of when it snows and how much moisture will translate into what. But you don't have to just think inches, right, which is how we describe it here, but you can think whatever it is. It's a 10-to-1 ratio. However, do know that it's very reasonable at times for that range to be anywhere from 5-to-1 and even get as high as 50-to-1, depending on the temperature that's outside and the structure of not just the temperature where you're feeling, but how much moisture is available to work with, and the temperature profile going up in the atmosphere. All these things come into play with how that translates into what type of snow crystals are created. And we've talked a little bit about that in the past, but that translates into how much measurement is it in inches, because is it one of those light fluffy snows, or is it one of those heavy compacting snows? So it can be quite a wide range. And 10-to-1, that's just a relative number that we tend to use because it's a reasonable estimate for a broad swath of situations, right? But it doesn't always hold true by any means. All right, we're running a little long here, so let me wrap up. You know the drill about how to get hold of us, but as always, I like to remind you, whatisitabouttheweather@gmail.com, or you can just go to whatisitabouttheweather.com and hit the contact form, right? Thank you for your continued support of the podcast. You know our methodology here: rate, share, validate, and pledge. Whichever way you're doing it, thank you. Some future episode, again, I'll hit a little more detail about those if they don't make sense to you. But keep going out there in your weather world. Keep it intertwined. Now you have an opportunity to learn a little bit more. And always keep in mind that there's much more to the weather than the weather itself.